Hey everyone, it's Joe Kral, and again, welcome back to Pro-Life University. We're going to dive really into part 2 of our series on pro-life anti-coercion legislation. And just a little bit of a refresher from last week, we talked a little bit about some of the actual historical aspects of coercion. And here in part 2, we're going to talk about the sin of coercion, really kind of a theology of coercion. Why do people coerce others, and why do people listen? These are really important sorts of questions that we have to answer to get a better understanding, if you will, a better idea of the fallen human nature and why it needs correction and so forth. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to get into the psychology of things. I'm going to get into the theology of it. And I think that's really important because in many ways, the theology kind of brings out, if you will, many aspects of the human nature that sometimes just aren't explained necessarily by science and so forth. So let's just go ahead and dive into this idea, a little exploration, if you will, of fallen human nature. And I stress that word fallen because in many ways, when we talk about fallen human nature, we got to go back to the actual story of the fall itself. And so we really need to look at the story of the fall in Genesis chapter 3. But before we jump to there, let's get a little bit of an idea of what's going on in Genesis chapter 2. Because in Genesis chapter 2, we're kind of given the idea of how man and women are supposed to be within the garden and so forth. First, when God creates Adam, he gives him, a duty, a commandment, something that he's supposed to follow, something that he's supposed to do. And he's supposed to care and provide. That's the typical English translations that we see. In many respects, if we were to kind of retranslate, go back to the ancient language that it was in, the original Hebrew, right? It would be actually probably better translated to talk about how man's duty is to guard and protect the garden, right? So this is kind of an interesting thing, this idea of guard and protect. In many ways kind of helps us shape and understand a little bit about the fall, because we're going to certainly talk about what this means with respect to the fall and how Adam does fall, and he just does the complete opposite of this sort of thing. Now, we got to remember, when Adam is given this duty to guard and protect, it's meant to be a selfless act, all right? That he gives of himself, all right? We got to remember that the garden, we have mankind in its original state in communion with God. And this is an important sort of concept to fundamentally understand. Man in his original state, his unfallen state, his original state of grace, his original state of justice, right, is going to act appropriately man, right? He's going to act as appropriate man. He's going to act according to his human nature. And so he's going to be selfless in his actions, right? Now, what do we see in the fall? We certainly have the story of the fall. And Adam, all of a sudden, we see something shift in here. And his actions don't necessarily become selfless. They become selfish, right? He fails to protect his wife against the serpent, right? We definitely see that. And in many respects, he is even willing to risk her immortal self, right? Because one of the commandments, if you recall, is that if they eat of the fruit, they would die. Surely they would die. And again, he's willing to risk his wife. So really we see this twist even a little bit before he even eats it. And then he eats it, and then then it's the final say-so. This is the final yes, or if you will, his final no is probably a good better way of saying his no to God, right? Yes to himself and his yes to selfishness. Right? In many ways, we see this, and it becomes a destructive sort of power. Instead of guarding and protecting his wife, guarding and protecting the garden, he becomes selfish, and as a result, he only thinks of himself, and destruction comes in as a result of that. So that's an important sort of thing to see here. So when we talk about this idea of coercion, right, In many ways, it's a destructive sort of power because it's inherently selfish. It's about the self. And so we need to understand that in many ways, this extends into our own very day, where coercion, why one of the reasons why men are coercing other women into literally destroying their unborn children is precisely because of this idea, precisely because of this fallen nature, rather, that has changed this. What they're supposed to do, what they're honestly supposed to do to guard and protect, all right? So, and again, their unborn child, the natural inclination of man is supposed to be to guard and protect. Yet here we see this inclination, a fallen inclination, wanting to destroy instead. So in many ways, this helps explain this idea of the sin of coercion, if you will. Now, let's look at the sin, or rather Eve's sin here to some extent as well. Now, one of the things that we see is, and we certainly get this picture from the story of Genesis, is that women's role in many ways is to be nurturing, all right? They nurture the child physiologically, biologically, especially within the womb. They help nurture the family and so forth. And so in some ways, we see something happen and develop within the fall that becomes highly problematic. In particular, we see something that God says to Eve. He tells her that her husband will become her master, and she will have a strong urge for him, and he shall become her master. Now, what does he mean by this? To some extent, it seems, at least in my honest opinion, that she wants to please to a fault. All right, she wants to please her husband, and in particular, in this case, to please him to such a degree that it allows for this destruction. All right. Now, in many respects, we got to understand, all right, that God is basically saying, look, you're going to suffer from this fallen nature because of your sinful action of eating the forbidden fruit. And your intellect, your will, in some ways is going to become overshadowed with this fallen nature. And it's going to have this strong desire. In some cases, that you're going to be so scared about certain things. You don't want to sit there and have certain realities happen. That you're willing to go along with these sorts of things as well. And I think in many respects, that's why we see, and as we were talking about just last week, roughly 2/3 of women feel pressured into having an abortion. This is an important sort of thing here. Why are they doing this? Well, they obviously feel pressured. They feel this strong urge. They want to try to please whoever they're trying to please, whether that be their husband, their boyfriend, or whomever. And as a result, this horrible thing where the destruction of life occurs. All right. So in many ways, we see this sort of theology sort of blossoming out about the human person and why we have this particular problem when it comes to abortion. And we got to understand abortion is a sin and coercion is a sin. Man is going to do something destructive, right? In his fallen state, he has this capacity to do destructive things. At times, women become so scared or want to please to such a fault that they're willing to sit there and go along with the action and allow this sort of destruction take place. And I kind of think that's what we see here in the story. In many ways, yes, Eve is the one that takes the fruit and eats the fruit, but she offers it to her husband. And at no point in time do we see this, do we see Adam say, stop, don't do that sort of thing. Devil, you need to get out of here. We don't see him standing up to protect his wife. And she kind of follows along because of that, because of his failure to do what was right. And in many cases, that's what we have here with respect to abortion as well, is his failure to protect that unborn child, his failure to say, look, we are going to get through this. We're going to raise this child. This child is going to be a beautiful gift. And as a result, since he's not doing that, since he's saying, well, if you don't do this, I'm not going to pay child support. If you don't do this, I'm going to leave you. And as a result, she kind of goes along with it, unfortunately, and it leads to the destruction of the child. So in many ways, we can see this sort of thing happening even in our own everyday sort of world and in our own reality right now, unfortunately. Well, again, I hope you enjoyed it. I don't want to stay on here too long. Next week, we're going to cover another portion of pro-life anti-coercion legislation. We're going to really kind of dive into the legislation itself. All right, so I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. If you have any questions about this whole theology, this whole theological conversation that we just had, please put it down in the comments. Be sure to subscribe and give us a big thumbs up. We always appreciate that. And I hope you have a blessed weekend. God bless.